Penn Station, on a Friday evening in November, carried the weight of 10,000 people trying to escape New York City before the weekend traffic turned the tunnels into parking lots. The air tasted of burnt pretzels, diesel exhaust, and the particular brand of desperation that came from commuters who'd already missed two trains. Robert Wilson stood near Gate 7, one trembling hand gripping the handle of a portable oxygen concentrator, while the other clutched a crumpled Amtrak ticket to Boston. The machine at his hip wheezed in rhythm with his own labored breathing, a duet of mechanical persistence and biological failure. 78 years had carved deep lines into Bobby's face, but the last 6 months had done worse. The cancer had hollowed him from the inside, turning muscle into memory and leaving behind skin stretched over bones that seemed eager to break free. His cardigan hung loose, 3 sizes too large for what remained of him. The Holter monitor strapped to his chest blinked a steady red pulse beneath the fabric recording every irregular heartbeat for doctors who'd already stopped pretending they could fix anything. The boarding call crackled over speakers designed for volume rather than clarity. Bobby shuffled forward, each step a negotiation between gravity and willpower. People flowed around him like water around a stone, their eyes sliding past without seeing. In a city of 8 million, a dying old man pulling an oxygen tank was just another obstacle between them and wherever they were going. The gap between platform and train car yawned wider than it should have. Bobby stared at it for 3 long seconds, calculating angles and consequences. His legs hadn't been reliable in months. The braces hidden beneath his pants helped, but not enough. Not for this. A hand appeared at his elbow. The conductor, a black man in his 60s, with silver temples and kind eyes, steadied him across the threshold. "Easy does it, sir. No rush." Bobby wanted to thank him but lacked the breath. He managed a nod and hauled himself and his equipment into the narrow corridor of Coach Car 7. The oxygen concentrator's wheels caught on the rubber mat. He yanked it free with more force than necessary, and the sudden movement sent a lightning bolt of pain from his lower spine up through his shoulders. He bit down on his tongue hard enough to taste copper. The car stretched ahead like a tunnel with no end. Every seat seemed occupied by someone aggressively ignoring the world through headphones or deliberately claiming extra space with designer bags and expensive coats. Bobby dragged himself forward, the rhythmic thump of the oxygen machine announcing his presence to people who refused to acknowledge it. A businessman in a gray suit glanced up from his phone, saw Bobby's approach, and immediately placed his leather briefcase on the empty seat beside him. The message was clear. Bobby kept moving. 3 rows from the back, he found it. 1 seat aisle position blessedly empty. The window seat was occupied by a man who looked like he'd been carved from something harder than flesh. Mid-40s, built like he still remembered how to hurt people efficiently. A black tactical jacket worn but clean, dark jeans, combat boots that had seen actual combat. A baseball cap pulled low enough to shadow eyes that Bobby couldn't quite see, but could feel watching everything. What kept other passengers away wasn't the man. It was the dog. A German shepherd lay curled in the narrow space between the man's boots and the seat in front of him, its coat a mixture of charcoal gray and burnt amber that made it look more wolf than domestic animal. The harness it wore wasn't the cheerful vest of a service dog. This was tactical gear reinforced at every stress point with a handle on top designed for hauling the animal through windows or over walls. A patch on the side read, in block letters, "Do not pet. Working canine." Bobby stopped at the row, his oxygen machine wheezing into the silence. The man's eyes opened. They were the color of winter storms, gray and utterly without warmth. His gaze traveled from Bobby's face down to the oxygen cannula, across to the Holter monitor's bulge beneath the cardigan, and finally to the trembling hands gripping the machine's handle. The assessment took perhaps 2 seconds. It felt longer. Bobby forced words past the tightness in his throat. "This seat taken." For a moment nothing. The man's expression didn't change. Then he raised one hand in a sharp, silent gesture, and the massive dog unwound itself from the floor with liquid grace. Without a sound, the animal pressed itself against its handler's shins, clearing the foot space completely. Bobby exhaled something that might have been relief or might have been the beginning of tears. He couldn't tell any more. "Thank you." The word came out as barely more than a whisper, but the man heard it. He gave a single economical nod and closed his eyes again, dismissing Bobby from whatever internal calculations he'd been running. Getting into the seat required a complicated series of movements that Bobby had practiced at home, but never quite mastered. He turned, swung the oxygen concentrator into position, and finally allowed himself to lean back against the threadbare cushion. The relief of being off his feet was so profound it made him dizzy. The train lurched forward without ceremony. Through the window, Penn Station's fluorescent hell began to slide backward, replaced first by the industrial guts of the rail yard, and then by the absolute darkness of the tunnel system beneath the East River. Bobby closed his eyes. The pain in his chest and back settled into its new baseline, a dull roar, instead of the screaming emergency it had been 5 minutes ago. Beside him, the man with the tactical jacket remained perfectly still, his breathing so controlled it was almost invisible. The dog's presence filled the space between them like a physical thing, warm and alert, and utterly focused on something Bobby couldn't identify. He'd known this would be hard, coming back, getting this close, riding a train toward the city where he'd been a husband and a father before he'd become a ghost. But Bobby Wilson hadn't ridden this particular route on this particular Friday by accident. He'd checked the schedules, read the local news section of the Boston Globe with the kind of attention most people reserved for lottery numbers. He'd seen the small article buried on page B7 about a local veteran returning from Virginia to visit his late mother's grave at Cedar Grove Cemetery. The article had included a photo, grainy, taken from too far away, but clear enough. Clear enough to recognize the shape of a jaw that matched Catherine's, the set of shoulders that came from Bobby's own father, dead 30 years now. Clear enough to see the dog at the man's side and know with the certainty that comes from reading every scrap of information you can find about someone for 38 years that this was him. Daniel Jackson, age 45, retired Navy SEAL, no wife, no children listed in any public record, living alone in a converted warehouse in South Boston's industrial district, visiting his mother's grave on the anniversary of her death, just like he did every year. Bobby had memorized the schedule, booked the same train, chosen a car toward the back where men like Daniel Jackson, men who'd spent decades in war zones, tended to sit because it gave them a view of everyone boarding and kept their backs to solid walls. The plan had been simple: get on the train, sit far enough away not to be noticed, watch his son for 2 hours, get off in Boston, die knowing what Danny looked like now in the flesh, breathing the same air for one last time. The plan had not included sitting directly beside him. The plan had definitely not included the duh. Bobby opened his eyes a crack and risked a glance at the animal. Ranger, the article had mentioned the dog's name, lay utterly still, but his amber eyes were wide open and fixed directly on Bobby's face. Not aggressive, not friendly, just watching. The kind of watching that came with calculations running behind it. Bobby looked away quickly. His heart monitor beeped a warning about elevated pulse. He tried to slow his breathing, but the oxygen machine couldn't keep up with the sudden spike of adrenaline flooding his system. This close, after 38 years of staying away, of watching from a distance, of being dead to everyone who'd ever mattered. He was sitting close enough to reach out and touch his son's arm. The temptation was physically painful. A cough built in his chest, the kind that had been coming more frequently over the past month. He tried to suppress it, but his lungs had stopped taking orders from his brain somewhere around the third round of chemotherapy. The cough tore out of him, wet and harsh, and he grabbed for the handkerchief in his pocket just in time to catch the blood. Not much. Not like last week, just a few dark spots on the white fabric that he folded quickly and shoved back out of sight, but enough that his whole body shook with the aftermath, enough that the oxygen machine's alarm started chirping about low saturation levels. The man beside him didn't react, didn't open his eyes, didn't turn his head, but the dog moved. Ranger stood up. It happened slowly enough that Bobby could have looked away, could have pretended not to notice. The dog rose to its full height, which was considerable, and turned to face Bobby directly. Those amber eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made Bobby's breath catch, for reasons that had nothing to do with cancer. Military working dogs didn't break position. Bobby knew that much from the articles he'd read, the documentaries he'd watched, the obsessive research that came from having nothing to do with the last decade of your life, except learn everything possible about the son you'd abandoned. Dogs like Ranger were trained to a level of discipline that made human willpower look like a suggestion. They didn't move without orders. They didn't engage with strangers. They especially didn't approach sick old men who smelled like death and prescription medication. Ranger approached anyway. The movement was deliberate, almost careful. The dog stepped forward until its massive head hovered directly over Bobby's lap. For one terrible second, Bobby thought it was going to bite him, and he couldn't even muster the energy to be afraid. If Danny's dog killed him, at least it would be quick. At least it would be something Danny did, even if he never knew it. The dog lowered its head. The weight settled onto Bobby's knee with surprising gentleness, and suddenly he was looking directly into amber eyes that seemed to be reading something written in his DNA. The dog's breath was warm against his hands. Its expression, if dogs could be said to have expressions, held no aggression, just a focused, almost clinical assessment, like a doctor taking inventory of symptoms. Bobby's hand moved before his brain could authorize it. His fingers found the thick fur behind Ranger's ears, and the dog's eyes half closed at the contact. Not submission, not pleasure exactly, just acceptance. Beside him, the man with the tactical jacket finally moved. His eyes opened fully, and Bobby saw them for the first time without shadows. Gray, like he'd thought, but not cold. Calculating, yes. Dangerous, absolutely, but not empty. These were eyes that had seen things and decided to keep living anyway. The man stared at his dog with an expression Bobby couldn't quite read. Confusion, maybe, or concern. His hand twitched toward his hip, toward something Bobby suspected was a weapon, before stopping. "I'm sorry." Bobby's voice came out rougher than he'd intended, scraped raw by the coughing fit. I didn't mean he doesn't usually do this." The man's voice was deep-textured like gravel under tires, not unfriendly, but not warm either. Flat statement of fact delivered with the weight of someone who didn't waste words. Bobby forced himself to pull his hand back from the dog's head, but Ranger didn't move. The animal stayed exactly where it was, head resting on Bobby's knee, body angled to create a physical barrier between Bobby and the rest of the aisle. Do what? Ranger's a military working dog, multi-purpose canine, bomb detection, tracking, threat assessment. He's trained to ignore civilians. The man gestured vaguely at the crowded train car around them, at all the other passengers who might as well not exist for all the attention Ranger usually paid them. He's not a therapy dog. He doesn't comfort people. Bobby looked down at the massive head still resting on his leg, at the amber eyes that hadn't blinked in what felt like a full minute. Then why is he doing this? The man didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted from the dog to Bobby's face, and Bobby saw the analysis happening in real time. The oxygen cannula, the trembling hands, the gray pallor of terminal illness that no amount of fresh air could fix. Whatever conclusion the man reached, he kept it to himself. Don't know. But there was something in his voice, a thread of uncertainty that suggested he had theories. He just wasn't sharing them with a stranger on a train. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. Bobby wanted to say something, to fill the space with words that might explain why a combat-trained canine was currently treating him like a wounded soldier who needed protecting. But his throat had closed up again, and not because of the cancer. This close, he could see details the newspaper photos had missed. The scar that ran from Danny's left ear down beneath his collar, pale and surgical-looking. The way his right hand never quite relaxed, fingers slightly curled, as if always ready to grab something. The crow's feet at the corners of his eyes that suggested he'd learned to scan horizons for threats long before the smile lines could set in. Bobby had missed all of it. The years that had carved those scars, the wars that had taught those habits, the life that had happened while Bobby was busy being William Harper, fixing pipes in rural Vermont and pretending the past didn't exist. Ranger shifted position, and Bobby realized with a start that the dog was now fully between him and the aisle. Not aggressive exactly, but positioned. Like he'd decided that this particular sick old man needed a bodyguard and appointed himself to the job without waiting for permission. The man, Danny, though, Bobby, couldn't think of him that way without feeling like a thief stealing someone else's son, frowned at his dog. "Ranger, down!" The command came quiet but firm, the kind of voice that expected instant obedience. Ranger's ears swiveled toward his handler, acknowledging the order. Then the dog very deliberately settled more firmly onto Bobby's leg, chin resting heavy and warm against the thin fabric of his pants. For the first time since Bobby had sat down, something almost like emotion crossed the man's face. Surprise, maybe, or alarm. His hand moved again toward his hip, and Bobby saw it now, the slight bulge of a concealed holster beneath the tactical jacket. "That's not normal." The words came out more to himself than to Bobby, muttered, like someone working through a problem with variables that didn't add up. His eyes swept the train car, scanning faces and positions with the kind of automatic threat assessment that came from decades of staying alive in places designed to kill you. Bobby should have looked away, should have closed his eyes and pretended to sleep, but he couldn't stop watching his son's face, cataloging every micro-expression, storing memories like a dying man hoarding oxygen. The train emerged from the tunnel, into the fading orange light of late afternoon. Through the window, the industrial wasteland of northern New Jersey spread out in shades of rust and concrete. Cell towers and warehouse roofs, strip malls and parking lots, stretching toward a horizon already going purple with dusk. 3 rows ahead, a man in a navy blue suit stood up, smoothly, casually, like someone heading for the bathroom or the cafe car. But Bobby saw the way he paused, the way his hand drifted to the left side of his jacket, the way his eyes tracked to the back of the car before moving forward. Ranger saw it too. The dog's entire body went rigid, and a sound rolled out of his chest that Bobby felt more than heard. Not a growl exactly, deeper than that. Subsonic, the kind of sound that made prey animals freeze and predators reconsider their life choices. The man in the navy suit kept walking. Danny's posture changed in a way that was both subtle and absolute. 1 second, he'd been a tired traveler heading home. The next, every line of his body spoke a language Bobby had seen before in the eyes of Catherine's cousin, who'd come back from Desert Storm and couldn't stop checking the corners of rooms for 3 years afterward. Combat readiness, the kind that didn't turn off just because the war was over. Bobby. The name came out quiet, almost gentle, but weighted with the kind of authority that made it impossible not to respond. Bobby's head turned before he'd consciously decided to obey. "That is your name, right, Bobby?" He'd introduced himself when he sat down. He must have. Bobby nodded, not trusting his voice. "I need you to stay calm and answer a question. Have you noticed anyone following you today, at the hospital, on the platform, anywhere?" The question landed like ice water down Bobby's spine. His mind raced backward through the day. The final appointment at Memorial Sloan Kettering, Dr. Jonathan Parker's office, with its tasteful diplomas and leather furniture that cost more than Bobby's entire Vermont cabin. The waiting room where he dozed off halfway through his second cup of the green tea they always offered. The walk to Penn Station, which had taken 40 minutes instead of 15 because his legs wouldn't cooperate, and the oxygen machine kept losing battery charge. Had anyone followed him, he'd barely been able to see straight through the pain medication. "No, I don't. I came straight from the hospital. Memorial Sloan Kettering. Cancer treatment." Bobby's hand moved involuntarily to the Holter monitor beneath his cardigan. "I'm just trying to get to Boston." "Why, what's—" "Don't look forward. Keep your eyes on me or on Ranger." The command cut through Bobby's rising panic. He locked his gaze on Danny's face and saw something there that made his chest tighten for reasons that had nothing to do with tumors or failing organs. Recognition, not of Bobby specifically, that would be impossible, but of something, some pattern or threat assessment that had triggered alarm bells in a mind trained to see danger before it arrived. "The man in the blue suit, 3 rows up. He's been watching you." Bobby's fingers clenched around the armrest. The vinyl creaked under his grip. "I don't know who—" "I know, but he knows you. Or knows something about you." Danny's right hand had disappeared beneath his jacket. When it emerged, it held nothing but— Bobby knew what it had been checking, making sure the weapon was there, making sure it was ready. "I need you to trust me for the next few minutes. Can you do that?" Could he? Bobby looked down at Ranger, who was now staring at the man in the blue suit with the kind of focused intensity that probably made insurgents in Kabul reconsider their choices. The dog's lips had pulled back just enough to show the tips of white teeth that looked designed for ending arguments permanently. 38 years of staying away, of being dead, of protecting his family by ensuring they never had to see him again, never had to know that he'd chosen to abandon them rather than fight for them. And now, sitting next to the son who thought his father had died in a train accident when he was 7 years old, Bobby was being asked if he could trust a stranger. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't terrifying. Yes? The word came out steady, stronger than Bobby expected. Danny's eyes met his for a fraction of a second, and something passed between them that Bobby couldn't name. Understanding, maybe. Or just the acknowledgement that they were both in this together now, whatever this was. Danny pulled out his phone, thumbed it open, and typed something one-handed while keeping his eyes on the man in the blue suit. Then he shifted his position slightly, angling his body to create a better line of sight to the aisle while maintaining cover behind the seat back. "Tell me about your hospital visit. What did they do?" The question seemed random, disconnected from the threat 3 rows ahead. Bobby struggled to focus. "Routine checkup. They adjusted my heart monitor. Dr. Parker said it needed recalibration." "Did they take the monitor into a back room?" "Yes, the lab. I signed a consent form, waited about 45 minutes. When something shifted in Danny's expression, not quite alarm, but close. "Did you feel unusual after that drowsy, disoriented?" Bobby thought back. He'd assumed the exhaustion was just cancer, being cancer the way it always was. But there had been something else. A heaviness in his limbs after drinking the tea Dr. Parker had given him, a fuzziness in his thoughts that had made the walk to Penn Station feel like moving through molasses. "Maybe. The tea they gave me. I fell asleep in the waiting room." "What tea?" "Green tea. They always offer it. Dr. Parker brought it himself this time." Danny's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His free hand moved to Bobby's chest, and before Bobby could react, Danny's fingers found the edge of the Holter monitor beneath the cardigan. He ran his thumb along the plastic casing, and Bobby felt the pressure even through the fabric. "There's a scratch here, along the seam, fresh." Bobby looked down. He couldn't see it, but Danny's fingers were tracing something on the device's edge. "They opened this recently." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that had been burning all along invisible until someone pointed it out. Bobby's heart monitor chose that moment to start beeping an irregular rhythm warning, and Danny's hand moved away. "What are you saying?" But Bobby already knew. Some part of him had known since Dr. Parker's unusually friendly demeanor 2 days ago, since the special tea, since the way the medical assistant had avoided eye contact when taking the monitor back to the lab. He'd known, but knowing and accepting were different things. Someone put something in your medical equipment, something valuable enough that they're willing to follow you onto a train to get it back. Bobby's mind stuttered over the implications. He was dying. He had maybe 4 months left, if the tumors were feeling generous. He owned nothing of value except a cabin in Vermont that was worth less than the mortgage he'd stopped paying 3 years ago. He had no enemies, no connections, no reason for anyone to. The train lurched suddenly, and somewhere up front, the emergency brake system engaged with a hydraulic scream that sounded like metal tearing. Bobby's oxygen concentrator tilted forward, and Danny's arm shot out, catching both Bobby and the machine before either could hit the floor. The train didn't slow gradually. It stopped. Hard enough that passengers standing in the aisle went sprawling. Hard enough that luggage rained down from overhead compartments. Hard enough that Bobby's teeth clicked together and his vision went white with pain as his spine compressed against the seat back. Then the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in after 2 seconds that felt like an hour, casting everything in sickly yellow that made shadows twice as long and half as trustworthy. People were screaming, some from pain, most from confusion, and the primal fear of being trapped in the dark. Bobby felt Danny move beside him, efficient and purposeful even in the chaos. One arm stayed locked around Bobby's shoulders, keeping him pinned safely to the seat. The other had drawn the weapon from his hip. Bobby saw it now, a black semi-automatic that looked like it had seen hard use and careful maintenance in equal measure. Ranger was on his feet, body pressed against Bobby's legs, facing forward with every muscle coiled tight. The dog wasn't making a sound, but Bobby could feel the tension radiating off him like heat from asphalt in August. "Stay down!" Danny's voice cut through the screaming, not loud, but commanding in a way that made Bobby's body obey before his brain caught up. Danny's hand pressed Bobby's head below the seat line, and through the gap between rows, Bobby saw shoes moving in the aisle. Work boots, expensive ones, moving with purpose toward the back of the car. Then the screaming got louder, more focused, and Bobby heard a woman's voice cutting through the panic. "I'm a nurse! I'm a nurse! Let me help!" The voice was young female and trying very hard to sound calm despite circumstances that made calm impossible. Bobby risked lifting his head just enough to see a woman in her early 30s pushing through the crowd, a messenger bag bouncing against her hip. She had light brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her face carried the kind of exhaustion that came from too many shifts and not enough sleep. But her eyes were sharp, scanning the car for injuries with the automatic assessment of someone who'd spent years learning to triage chaos. Rebecca Anderson. The name came to Bobby from the business card she'd handed him 15 minutes ago, back when the world had still made sense. She'd been sitting across the aisle reading a textbook about palliative care, and she'd seen him struggling with his oxygen machine settings. She'd offered help quietly, professionally, with the kind of gentle competence that made Bobby want to cry. He'd waved her off, but she'd left her card anyway, just in case. Now she was moving through the darkened train car, checking on passengers, offering reassurance in a voice that suggested everything would be fine, even though the train had stopped. In what Bobby could now see through the window was the middle of the East River Tunnel. No cell service, no way out except through the doors that were designed not to open until the train reached a station. No light except the emergency backups, which were already starting to flicker. They were trapped. Bobby's medical mind, still functional despite decades of disuse, started running calculations. Air circulation in a sealed train car. Oxygen concentrator battery life. The number of people in this car alone, all breathing the same recycled air. If they were stuck here for more than a few hours, glass shattered somewhere ahead. Not the clean break of an accident, the deliberate crunch of something heavy going through a window designed to resist exactly that. Danny moved. Fluid and fast, he holstered his weapon and grabbed Bobby's shoulder. "Listen to me very carefully. I'm going to the front of the car to see what's happening. Ranger is going to stay with you. Do not move from this seat. Do not let anyone touch your heart monitor. If someone tries, Ranger will stop them. Do you understand?" Bobby nodded, unable to form words past the fear clogging his throat. Danny made a gesture with his left hand, some signal Bobby didn't recognize, but Ranger clearly did. The dog's posture shifted, and suddenly he was standing with his front paws on Bobby's lap, his body creating a physical wall between Bobby and the aisle. The amber eyes locked onto Bobby's face, and the message was unmistakable. "You're mine now. I'm not letting anyone near you." Danny stood, and Bobby watched his son disappear into the chaos with the same smooth efficiency he'd probably used in 100 combat zones. Gone in 3 seconds, swallowed by shadows and panicking passengers. Bobby sat in the flickering emergency light, a dying old man with a dog he'd met 20 minutes ago, acting as his personal guardian, and wondered how exactly his plan to die quietly in Boston had turned into this. Someone was coming down the aisle. Bobby could hear the footsteps, deliberate and unhurried despite the chaos. Through the forest of standing passengers and fallen luggage, he caught glimpses of a gray hoodie and a medical mask. The man stopped at their row. He looked down at Bobby with eyes that showed no emotion, no recognition, nothing that suggested he saw a person instead of an object that needed to be retrieved. His hand emerged from the hoodie pocket, holding a crowbar. "Sorry about this, old man. Nothing personal." The crowbar started to descend toward Bobby's chest, toward the Holter monitor that apparently contained something worth killing for. Ranger didn't bark, didn't give warning. The dog simply launched himself forward like 90 pounds of muscle, and calculated violence, jaws open wide enough that Bobby saw every tooth in perfect detail. The crowbar never made it to Bobby's chest. The man in the hoodie started screaming before he hit the floor, and Bobby closed his eyes against the sound of bone breaking and the wet, terrible noise of a military working dog doing exactly what he'd been trained to do. Protect his charge, by any means necessary. The screaming from the back of the car cut through every other sound like a blade through silk. Danny moved against the tide of panicking passengers, his body angling sideways to slip through gaps that shouldn't have existed. Years of close-quarters combat had taught him to make himself smaller when necessary, to find the negative space between bodies and exploit it. The vestibule door hung crooked on its hinges, the reinforced glass shattered into a spider web pattern that suggested something heavy had hit it from the inside. Danny paused at the threshold, his fingers finding the grip of his Glock by muscle memory before his conscious mind registered the need. The emergency lighting barely penetrated the narrow connector space between cars, turning shadows into potential threats and making depth perception a matter of faith rather than certainty. A man lay crumpled against the rubber accordion seal, his conductor's uniform dark with blood that looked black in the yellow glow. George Turner, according to the name badge, visible when Danny crouched beside him. Early 60s gray at the temples, breathing shallow but steady. A gash across his forehead leaked red down into his eyes. Danny pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck, feeling for the pulse he could already see in the flutter of the carotid artery. "George, can you hear me?" The conductor's eyes struggled to focus, pupils dilated unevenly. Concussion, probably. Maybe worse. 2 men, blue suit and a big one, leather jacket. The words came thick slurred around a tongue that didn't want to cooperate. George's hand fumbled for Danny's wrist, gripping with surprising strength. "Asked about cameras? Dead zone cameras? I told them there aren't any in the tunnel. They hit me." Danny's jaw tightened. Someone had planned this, known the exact stretch of track where surveillance couldn't reach, where a stopped train would be invisible to every monitoring system the Transit Authority had installed after September 11th. This wasn't opportunistic. This was surgical. He pulled off his jacket and wadded it under George's head. "Stay down. Don't try to move. Help is coming." It wasn't a lie exactly. Eventually, help would come. The question was whether it would arrive before whoever had pulled the emergency brake finished whatever they'd started. Danny rose and moved to the connecting door to car 6. Through the fractured safety glass, he could make out shapes moving in the dimness. One shape in particular drew his attention, a silhouette that suggested mass and purpose in equal measure. The man stood at the far end of the car, backlit by the emergency exit sign's feeble glow. 6'4", maybe 250, wearing a leather jacket that strained across shoulders built for breaking things. His head swiveled methodically from row to row, checking faces with the kind of systematic sweep that spoke to professional training. Not military, wrong posture, but something close. Private security, maybe? Or the kind of contractor who got hired when legality became optional. A scar bisected the man's left cheek in a pale cross that caught what little light existed. When he turned his head, Danny saw the earpiece wire running down behind his collar and the slight bulge at his hip that meant he was carrying something larger than Danny's compact lock. The man was hunting, looking for someone specific among the terrified passengers pressed against their seats. His eyes moved past a crying mother, an elderly couple clutching each other, a teenager frozen with headphones still on, dismissed each one instantly, sorting through humans like files in a database. Danny understood the search parameters before the man finished his second row. Elderly, male, medical equipment. The description would have been specific enough to narrow the field to one, maybe two people in a full train car. They were looking for Bobby. The realization settled into Danny's gut with the weight of lead. Whatever was in that heart monitor, whatever doctor Parker had hidden inside medical equipment worn by a dying old man, it was valuable enough to stop a train and send at least 3 professionals to retrieve it. The economics of that equation were terrifying. Danny stepped back from the door, evaluating options. The vestibule offered minimal cover, just the narrow space and the conductor's unconscious body. The door opened inward, which meant anyone coming through would be focused on the opening, not on the shadows to either side. Standard fatal funnel, the kind of mistake people made when they'd trained for speed over tactical awareness. He pressed himself against the wall beside the doorframe and waited. The big man finished his visual sweep and started moving toward the back of the car, toward the broken vestibule door that marked the path to car 7, to Bobby. His boots hit the floor with the kind of deliberate weight that suggested he wanted people to hear him coming, wanted them to freeze in recognition of a predator moving through prey. The door opened. The man stepped through. Danny's forearm caught him across the throat before his second foot cleared the threshold. The impact drove the air from the man's lungs in a wet gasp, and Danny used the momentum to spin him into the wall. The metal rang with the collision loud enough that it should have drawn attention from the cars on either side, but the screaming from car 7 covered the sound completely. The big man recovered faster than Danny expected. His elbow came back hard, catching Danny in the ribs with enough force to crack bone if it had landed clean. Danny twisted, taking the blow on muscle instead of skeleton, and drove his knee into the man's thigh just above the kneecap. The leg buckled, but the man stayed upright through sheer stubbornness and a pain tolerance that spoke to serious professional experience. They grappled in the narrow space too close for either to use their weapons effectively. The man outweighed Danny by at least 60 pounds and had reach advantages that would have been decisive in any fair fight. Danny had stopped fighting fair around the same time he'd learned that the enemy didn't care about rules. He went for the joint locks, caught the man's right wrist, and twisted, hyperextending the elbow past its natural range of motion. Cartilage tore with a sound like wet paper ripping. The man's scream was raw and Russian words Danny didn't need to understand to know they involved extensive anatomical impossibilities. The man dropped to his knees, his ruined arm hanging at an angle that made Danny's own elbow ache in sympathy. But he was still conscious, still dangerous, and Danny needed answers more than he needed a clean, unconscious target. He pressed the Glock's muzzle against the base of the man's skull. "What's in the old man's heart monitor?" The Russian laughed, or tried to. It came out as a wet cough that sprayed blood onto the rubber floor. "Encrypted drive, CIA, blacklist, 50 million American dollars. The number hit Danny like a physical blow. 50 million! For data small enough to hide inside a medical device. That kind of money meant nation-state players' intelligence communities, the kind of operations that erased people from existence when they became inconvenient. "Who hired you?" "Dr. Parker, but he works for bigger fish, Volkov." The name meant nothing to Danny for half a second, and then memory supplied context from a briefing he'd sat through 6 years ago at Dam Neck. Elena Volkov, Russian organized crime, Boston operations. Connected to SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service that had replaced the KGB and learned nothing about subtlety in the transition. Elena Volkov, she's been dead for... She's alive, still wants her property back. The Russian's good hand moved toward his jacket, and Danny's finger tightened on the trigger by reflex, but the hand came out holding nothing more dangerous than a cell phone, which clattered to the floor when Danny kicked it away. "Ask the old man. He knows. He took something from her 38 years ago. She never forgot." Before Danny could process that impossibility, Bobby was dying of cancer. He owned nothing. He was nobody. Glass exploded inward from the door to car 6. The shot came from a Beretta 9mm. Danny's brain supplied automatically, the sound signature distinct, even muffled by the Russian's Kevlar vest. The Russian collapsed forward, alive but incapacitated. Danny was already moving, rolling sideways, as a second shot punched through the space where his head had been 2 seconds earlier. The man who stepped through the broken door frame wore the navy blue suit, like armor, every line pressed sharp enough to cut. Kenneth Mitchell. Danny didn't know the name yet, but he recognized the type. Corporate, professional, the kind of operative who'd learned to kill in government service and then sold that education to the highest bidder when the pension plan looked insufficient. Kenny's Beretta stayed level-trained on the center of Danny's chest with the kind of steady aim that came from thousands of rounds downrange. "Drop the weapon, soldier boy!" Danny's Glock was already pointed at Kenny's sternum, which meant they had achieved the kind of mutual standoff that usually ended with both parties bleeding out on the floor. Neither man moved. The Russian groaned between them, his breathing labored but regular. "You don't understand what you're protecting." Kenny's voice carried the smooth cadence of someone used to negotiating while armed, reasonable, almost friendly, the kind of tone that made people forget about the gun until it was too late. "That old man is carrying data that can collapse every CIA operation against Russian intelligence in North America. Names, addresses, protocols. 2 terabytes of classified material that your government has spent 20 years assembling. If it reaches Moscow, hundreds of people die. Our entire Eastern European network burns." Danny's finger stayed on the trigger, but his mind was racing through the logic. If Kenny was telling the truth, if Bobby was carrying intelligence that sensitive, then killing him made sense. Retrieve the data, eliminate the courier, blame it on the cancer. Clean, simple, untraceable. But Bobby didn't know. Danny had seen the genuine confusion when he'd mentioned the scratches on the monitor casing. The old man had been used, turned into a mule, without his knowledge or consent, which meant someone had decided that a dying stranger was an acceptable sacrifice for operational security. He's innocent. He doesn't know what he's carrying. Irrelevant. My contract is retrieval. The method is negotiable, but the outcome isn't. Kenny took a step forward, and Danny's world narrowed to finger pressure and breathing and the calculations of who could fire faster. They were too close for either to miss. Fire now, and they both died. Wait, and maybe one of them survived. The choice was made for him when Ranger's howl cut through the vestibule like a blade through silk. The sound carried every frequency of canine distress, the kind of vocalization that military working dogs only produced when their handler was in immediate danger or their primary objective was under attack. Danny's tactical brain supplied the translation instantly. Someone was threatening Bobby. Kenny's eyes flicked toward the sound just for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Danny lunged left, using the Russian's body as cover, and Kenny's shot went wide by inches. The bullet punched through the vestibule wall and out into the tunnel beyond, and then Danny was inside Kenny's reach, too close for the Beretta to track effectively. They fought in the space between cars with the efficiency of professionals who'd both been trained to kill in confined spaces. Kenny was good, former CIA. Danny's brain supplied from the way he moved, probably Special Activities Division. He knew the holds knew how to redirect. Force knew when to go for the eyes instead of wasting energy on body shots. But Danny had spent 2 decades learning to survive in places where hesitation meant death and fair fighting meant losing. He didn't waste time on elegant technique. He went for the throat, the groin, the knee, every target that would end the fight fastest. Kenny's elbow caught Danny across the jaw, hard enough to make his vision white out for a second. Danny tasted copper and felt a tooth shift loose in his gums. He responded by driving his thumb into the pressure point below Kenny's ear, the one that would drop blood pressure and consciousness in roughly equal measure. Kenny went down, but he took Danny with him, and they hit the vestibule floor in a tangle of limbs and desperate violence. The Beretta skittered away into the darkness. Danny's Glock was trapped beneath Kenny's weight. They fought with hands and elbows and whatever parts of their bodies could generate force. Danny got his forearm under Kenny's chin and pulled back, cutting off blood flow to the brain. Kenny bucked and twisted, trying to break the hold, his hands clawing for Danny's eyes. 30 seconds. That's how long it took to render someone unconscious with a proper blood choke. Danny counted off the seconds while Kenny thrashed beneath him, wondering if 30 seconds was fast enough to help whoever was threatening Bobby. 28 seconds in, Kenny went limp. Danny held the choke for another 5 count, making sure it wasn't a feint, then released and rolled clear. He grabbed Kenny's belt and zip-tied the man's wrists behind his back with the restraints he'd carried since Kabul, when trusting enemy surrender had meant dead friends. The Russian was trying to crawl toward the door to Car 6, dragging his useless arm behind him. Danny planted a boot on his back. "Stay down! You move, I shoot!" Whether the Russian understood English or just understood tone, he stopped moving. Danny retrieved his Glock, and Kenny's Beretta checked both magazines by touch and then ran for Car 7. Ranger's howling had stopped, which meant either the threat was over or the threat had won. Danny's heart hammered against his ribs as he shouldered through the broken vestibule door. The scene that met him belonged in a nightmare or a battlefield, not a passenger train. The man in the gray hoodie Chris Harris, though Danny wouldn't learn the name until later, lay on the floor between the seats, his right forearm twisted at an angle that suggested multiple fractures. Ranger stood over him, jaws still locked around the arm eyes, burning with the kind of focused intensity that made wolves look domesticated. Blood pooled beneath Chris's body, more than there should have been from a dog bite. The crowbar lay 3 feet away, and Bobby sat pressed back against the window, his face gray-white with shock, and his hands trembling so badly they looked like they belonged to someone else. Rebecca Anderson knelt beside Chris, her nurse's training overriding whatever horror she felt about treating someone who'd just tried to murder an elderly man. She'd fashioned a tourniquet from her belt and was applying pressure to the worst of the bleeding. Danny crossed the distance in 4 strides. "Ranger, out!" The command came sharp and clear, and Ranger released immediately. The dog backed up 1 step, 2, but stayed close enough to re-engage if Chris showed any sign of threat. Blood dripped from Ranger's muzzle, and his amber eyes never left the injured man. Danny grabbed Chris's good arm and wrenched it behind his back, securing it with another zip tie to the seat frame. The man whimpered, but didn't resist. Shock, probably, or the realization that resistance would bring the dog back. "Who sent you? Talk fast." Chris's eyes rolled whites, showing all around the iris. Kenny Mitchell, said it was easy money. Just get the monitor off the old guy. Nobody was supposed to get hurt. The words came in a rush, fear and pain stripping away whatever operational security he'd been taught. Amateur, or at least amateur enough to believe that following orders absolved him of consequences. Danny turned to Bobby, and what he saw made something in his chest tighten. The old man was staring at him with an expression that went beyond gratitude or relief. There was recognition there, not of Danny's face they'd never met before today, but of something deeper, something that made Bobby's eyes fill with tears that had nothing to do with physical pain. Rebecca stood up, her hands red to the wrists. "He'll live if we get him medical attention in the next hour. Beyond that, I can't promise anything." Her voice shook despite her best efforts at professional calm. She looked at Danny, at the gun still in his hand, at the unconscious and restrained men scattered through the train cars like debris from an explosion. "What the hell is happening?" It was a reasonable question. Danny wished he had a reasonable answer. Instead, he holstered his weapon and moved to Bobby's side. The old man was breathing too fast, his oxygen monitor beeping warnings about saturation levels dropping below safe thresholds. Danny reached out to steady the oxygen concentrator, and his fingers brushed against the Holter monitor beneath Bobby's cardigan. The device felt heavier than it should. Not by much, just a few ounces, but enough that Danny's trained hands noticed the difference. He pulled back the fabric and studied the casing in the emergency lighting. There, along the seam where the 2 halves joined a hairline scratch in the plastic, fresh enough that it hadn't oxidized yet, revealing the lighter color of the material beneath. Someone had opened this device recently. Someone with access to medical-grade tools and the technical knowledge to seal it back up so the patient wouldn't notice. "Bobby, when was the last time they serviced your heart monitor?" The old man's voice came out thin, stretched tight over terror. "2 days ago, Dr. Parker." "He said it needed recalibration." "Did they take you into a back room, leave you alone?" Yes, the lab. They gave me tea while I waited. I fell asleep. I thought it was just the medication making me tired." Danny pulled his multi-tool from his pocket, the same Leatherman that had followed him through 14 years of war zones and hadn't failed once. The screwdriver attachment was small enough to fit the recessed screws holding the monitor casing together. "I need to open this. It's going to alarm. Don't panic." Bobby nodded, and Danny went to work. The screws came out easily, too easily. Someone had removed them recently enough that the threads were still clean. The monitor started beeping protests sensing tampering, but Danny ignored it and pried the two halves of the casing apart. Inside, among the circuit boards and battery housing and medical sensors, something didn't belong. The chip was smaller than Danny's thumbnail attached to the internal housing with what looked like medical-grade adhesive. No manufacturer markings, just a small LED that pulsed red in the dimness, indicating active status. Beside it, printed in Cyrillic characters, too small to read, without magnification, a serial number. Danny used the tip of his knife to pry the chip free, careful not to damage the contacts. It came loose with a soft pop, and the LED went dark. He held it up to the emergency lighting, turning it over in his fingers. 2 terabytes of data if the Russian had been telling the truth. The kind of intelligence that would earn you a bullet behind the ear from your own side if they thought you were compromised. And someone had hidden it inside medical equipment worn by a dying man who had no idea he was carrying it. The sheer coldness of it made Danny's jaw clench hard enough to hurt. Use a terminal patient as a courier. If he gets caught, he dies of cancer before he can talk. If he doesn't get caught, retrieve the device, let him die naturally, and nobody asks questions. Clean, efficient, utterly without conscience. Bobby was staring at the chip with the expression of a man watching his entire understanding of reality come apart. I've never seen that before. I don't know what it is." "I know." Danny's voice came out gentler than he'd intended. He wrapped the chip in a piece of cloth torn from his shirt and secured it in the zippered pocket of his tactical vest. Evidence, leverage, insurance, whatever it needed to be when the authorities finally showed up. But Bobby wasn't finished. His hand reached out and caught Danny's wrist with surprising strength. "Danny!" The name fell into the space between them like a stone into still water. Danny froze. "How do you know my name?" "Your dog tag. I saw it when you moved earlier." It was a reasonable explanation. Plausible enough that Danny almost accepted it. But there was something in Bobby's eyes, something desperate and pleading that suggested the truth ran deeper than a glimpse of military identification. Rebecca moved closer, positioning herself between Bobby and the chaos that surrounded them. "Leave him alone. Can't you see he's in pain?" She faced Danny with the kind of protective anger that nurses developed after too many years watching patients suffer. Her hands were still bloody and she was shaking, but she didn't back down. "He's dying. He probably doesn't even know what's happening. Stop interrogating him like he's some kind of criminal." Danny wanted to explain that he wasn't interrogating anyone, that he was trying to understand how a nobody from Vermont had ended up carrying $50 million in stolen intelligence on a train to Boston. But before he could form the words, Bobby started coughing, not the dry hack from earlier. This was deeper, wetter, the kind of cough that came from lungs that were more tumor than tissue. Blood spattered onto the handkerchief Bobby pressed to his mouth, dark and thick. His whole body shook with the effort, and the oxygen monitor's alarms went from warning tones to full emergency screaming. Rebecca moved instantly, her training overriding fear. She checked Bobby's vitals, adjusted the oxygen flow, murmured reassurances that Danny suspected she didn't believe. "His O2 sat is dropping. He needs a hospital. Now." As if summoned by the desperation in her voice, light exploded into the tunnel from both directions. Searchlights mounted on vehicles Danny couldn't see but could imagine. Emergency response. Transit Authority. Probably NYPD Emergency Service Unit, given the circumstances. The sound of hydraulic cutting tools echoed through the tunnel metal, shrieking as they breached the sealed doors at the front of the train. Voices shouted commands in the organized chaos that came with tactical response to unknown threats. NYPD, everyone stay in your seats. Hands where we can see them. Danny stood slowly, his hands rising to shoulder height, palms open and empty. The Glock was holstered at his hip, and he kept his movements deliberate, broadcasting non-threat with every gesture. Retired Navy SEAL, I have 3 hostile subjects secured. They initiated the emergency stop. He pitched his voice to carry over the noise, using the command presence that had been drilled into him during Bud/S, and refined through years of leading teams into places where the wrong tone could mean dead teammates. A figure appeared in the shattered vestibule doorway, backlit by tactical lights that made identification impossible. The silhouette held an MP5 submachine gun in high, ready finger off the trigger, but ready to drop into firing position in a fraction of a second. "Show me your hands, both of them now." Danny complied, keeping his breathing steady and his posture non-threatening. Ranger moved closer to Bobby, positioning himself between the old man and the approaching officers. The dog's training warred with his newfound protective instinct, creating a tension Danny could feel from 6 feet away. More officers poured into the car, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had trained for this exact scenario. They secured Chris first, then moved to check on the Russian and Kenny in the vestibule. One officer stayed focused on Danny's weapon, trained on center mass, while his partner approached cautiously. "You said you're retired military." "Daniel Jackson, SEAL Team 3, 22 years, retired last year." Danny kept his voice level, providing information in clean, digestible chunks. The officer processing him relaxed fractionally, recognizing the speech patterns of someone who'd been through the same training pipeline, even if from a different service branch. "The weapon at your hip, is that your only firearm?" "Yes, legally registered, concealed carry permit in my wallet left rear pocket." The officer retrieved the wallet, checked the permit against Danny's face, and nodded to his partner. The MP5 came down from ready position, though it didn't quite lower all the way. They weren't taking chances, and Danny respected that. "What about the dog?" "Ranger, military working dog, retired with me. He's trained, but he's currently in protection mode. If you try to separate him from the older gentleman, he'll resist." The officer looked at Ranger, at Bobby, at the blood on the floor that came from Chris's mauled arm. "The man on the floor, the dog do that." "The man tried to attack Mr. Wilson with a crowbar. Ranger defended him." It wasn't quite the whole truth, but it was true enough for the moment. The officer made a note and moved on to securing the scene. More personnel arrived: paramedics, transit authority, supervisors, and, finally, 2 people in dark suits that screamed federal law enforcement. The first one through was a man in his early 50s, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had forgotten how to smile somewhere around his 3rd divorce and 2nd congressional hearing. His badge identified him as FBI, and his eyes cataloged the entire scene in the time it took most people to register that something was wrong. He stopped in front of Danny, and recognition flashed across his features so fast that most people would have missed it. "Jesus, Danny Jackson! Last time I saw you, you were pulling a senator's kid out of a Taliban compound in Helmand." Danny's memory supplied a name to match the face. "Agent Steve Mitchell, Task Force North. You were running intelligence liaison. Still am, more or less, though these days it's Russian organized crime instead of Taliban logistics. Steve's eyes moved past Danny to Bobby, who was being attended by two paramedics while Rebecca supervised. The old man looked smaller, somehow diminished by fear and pain and the crushing weight of understanding that he'd been used without his knowledge. That the courier, no, that's the victim. Someone at Memorial Sloan Kettering planted intelligence in his medical equipment without his knowledge. He's terminal, 4 months, maybe less. They turned him into a blind mule. Steve's expression hardened into something that would have made Marble jealous. Who's the doctor? Jonathan Parker, oncology, and before you ask, yes, I have the chip. Danny pulled the wrap device from his pocket and held it out. Steve took it like it was radioactive, which in a professional sense it probably was. You know what this is? Russian intelligence told me it's a CIA blacklist. Eastern European network. 2 terabytes, worth $50 million. Steve's face went carefully neutral in the way that confirmed everything. Russian intelligence. Past tense, I hope. He's in the vestibule with a dislocated shoulder. His partner's in the car behind us, unconscious. The one who hired them, Kenneth Mitchell, is secured in the vestibule as well. Steve's head came up sharply. Kenneth Mitchell? Said his name was Kenny. Former CIA, if I'm reading the skill set correctly, working private retrieval now. Something shifted in Steve's expression, not quite pain, but close. The kind of look that came from discovering family members in places they shouldn't be. Kenny's my brother, or he was before he decided government salary wasn't enough and started selling his training to the highest bidder. The weight of that admission settled over the conversation like fog. Steve pulled out his phone and typed something one-handed, never taking his eyes off Danny. You did good work here, kept a bad situation from getting worse. But I'm going to need full statements from everyone involved, starting with Mr. Wilson. He needs a hospital. The voice came from Rebecca, who had appeared at Danny's elbow without him noticing. Her scrubs were ruined with blood and exhaustion pulled at the corners of her eyes, but she met Steve's gaze without flinching. That man has stage 4 lung cancer with metastasis to his bones. He just survived an attempted murder and a panic attack that probably did more damage to his heart than the cancer has in 6 months. If you want a statement, you can take it at Boston General after he's been stabilized. Steve looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Fair enough. Paramedics are setting up a stretcher now. He can ride to the nearest trauma center with full escort. Boston General! Danny's voice cut through the discussion. Both Rebecca and Steve turned to look at him. He was traveling to Boston. His destination matters. Boston General has his medical records, knows his case. Shipping him to a random trauma center in New York is going to delay treatment while they play catch-up with his oncology team. Steve considered this, then spoke into his phone again. Whatever response he got made him grimace, but he nodded. Boston General it is. But you're riding with him, Jackson, and you're not leaving my sight until I have the full story. It wasn't a request. Danny understood that. He also understood that the moment Bobby Wilson arrived at a hospital, he would be placed in protective custody while the FBI unraveled whatever conspiracy had turned a dying man into a courier. The old man would spend his last months answering questions in sterile rooms, reliving the violation of having his body used as a smuggling container. Unless Danny could give them a reason to believe Bobby was genuinely innocent. The paramedics arrived with a stretcher, and the process of moving Bobby began. He was so light, they barely needed two people to lift him. Ranger followed without being commanded, his body language making it clear that separation wasn't an option under consideration. Danny fell into step beside the stretcher, and Steve matched his pace. "Off the record, Jackson, how much of what Wilson told you do you believe?" Danny thought about the confusion in Bobby's eyes when the chip was revealed, the genuine shock, the way his hands had shaken when he'd realized someone had opened his medical device without his knowledge. "All of it. He's a civilian, terminally ill, no criminal record, no connections to intelligence communities. Someone chose him because he was convenient and disposable. And yet someone from Russian organized crime seems to think he stole something from them 38 years ago, according to the big guy in the vestibule." The words hit Danny like cold water. 38 years ago, 1986. The year Bobby claimed his wife had been alive. His son had been 7 years old. His life had been normal. The year Danny's father had died in a train accident. His hand moved to his chest without conscious thought, fingers finding the dog tags beneath his tactical vest. 2 tags, one with his own service number and information, one that his mother had given him when he'd joined the Navy, pressed into his palm with instructions to never lose it, never forget where he'd come from. The second tag belonged to Robert Eugene Wilson, his father, dead in a train accident in New Hampshire in 1986 when Danny had been 7 years old and the world had made sense. Danny pulled the tags out, holding his father's ID in the emergency lighting. The name stamped into the metal seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. Robert E. Wilson, Bobby Wilson. The old man on the stretcher turned his head, and his eyes found Danny's across the space between them. In those eyes, Danny saw something that made his blood turn to ice and his heart forget how to beat. Recognition, guilt, grief, love. The kind of love that had survived 38 years of absence and came roaring back the moment the distance closed enough to matter. Danny's voice, when it came, sounded like it belonged to someone else. "What's your full name?" Bobby's lips trembled. His hands clenched the stretcher rails hard enough to make the knuckles white. "Robert Eugene Wilson." The world tilted sideways. Danny's vision narrowed to a tunnel that contained only Bobby's face, searching for the man his mother had loved. The father who'd died before Danny was old enough to remember what his voice sounded like, and found him. Older, broken, dying, but alive, breathing, real. My father's name was Robert Eugene Wilson. The words fell into the space between them like stones into a grave. He died in 1986. Train accident. I was 7 years old. Bobby's face crumpled, tears spilling over cheeks that had probably forgotten how to cry decades ago. "I didn't die, Danny." The name, his name, spoken in a voice that carried echoes of bedtime stories Danny couldn't quite remember, and birthday mornings that existed only in photographs his mother had kept in a box he wasn't allowed to touch. "I had to disappear. Elena Volkov would have killed you and your mother if I'd stayed." Danny's hands moved without his permission, grabbing the stretcher rail hard enough to make the metal creak. Ranger whined, sensing distress, but unable to identify the source. "You're lying!" But even as he said it, Danny knew it was false. The evidence was overwhelming. The name, the age, the anchor tattoo, visible now on Bobby's wrist, faded but unmistakable, identical to the one his mother had described in the journal she'd kept after the funeral. The shape of his face beneath the ruin of cancer, similar enough to the photographs Danny had memorized that the resemblance couldn't be coincidence. Rebecca stepped between them, her hand on Danny's chest, pushing him back with surprising strength. "Whatever this is, it can wait. He needs medical attention now." But Danny couldn't let it wait. 38 years of believing his father was dead, of growing up without the man who was supposed to teach him how to be strong, how to be good, how to matter. 38 years of his mother working 3 jobs and crying herself to sleep when she thought Danny couldn't hear. 38 years of absence that had shaped every choice Danny had made, every path he'd chosen, every time he'd decided to be the kind of man his father had never gotten the chance to be. And all of it had been a lie. "You left us." The words came out raw, torn from somewhere deep in Danny's chest that he'd thought he'd sealed off after Kabul, after watching friends die for causes that turned out to be lies, after learning that the world didn't care about fair or just or right. Mom worked herself to death, 3 jobs, 60-hour weeks just to keep us fed. I grew up without a father because you chose to leave. Bobby was sobbing now, the oxygen cannula barely keeping up with his labored breathing. "I watched you from afar. Every birthday, every graduation. I kept every article about you, every medal." His shaking hands pulled a wallet from his pocket, leather worn soft from decades of use. Inside, folded carefully, between expired credit cards and receipts from gas stations in Vermont, a newspaper clipping. Danny recognized it immediately. The photograph from the Boston Globe in 2002, taken the day he'd completed BUD/S training. 23 years old, freshly minted seal, standing at attention in his dress whites with the trident gleaming on his chest. His mother had framed that picture. It had hung in her living room until the day she died, and, apparently, his dead father had kept a copy in his wallet for 22 years. The implications crashed over Danny like waves over a drowning man. His father had been alive, watching, following Danny's life from a distance while maintaining the fiction of death. Every achievement Danny had earned, every battle he'd survived, every time he'd pushed himself harder because he was determined to be better than the ghost of a man who died too young his father had known, had been proud, had stayed away anyway. Ranger moved between them, whining softly. The dog pressed against Danny's legs, then moved to Bobby, then back to Danny, confused by the scent markers that his highly trained nose was detecting. Blood relation, genetic similarity, the same DNA expressed in different bodies, different generations. The dog knew what Danny's brain was still trying to reject. Ranger sat down precisely between them and placed his head on Bobby's knee. The same gesture he'd made earlier when he'd first decided Bobby needed protection. But now the meaning was different. Family, pack, the fundamental unit that dogs understood instinctively and humans spent lifetimes trying to figure out. Steve Mitchell watched the scene unfold with the expression of someone who'd seen too many family reunions go wrong to believe this one would end differently. "We're moving out. This discussion continues at the hospital." The paramedics started wheeling Bobby toward the ambulance, and Danny found himself following without consciously deciding to move. Ranger walked at his side close enough that Danny could feel the warmth of the dog's body through his pants. Bobby reached out as they passed his hand, finding Danny's with the desperate grip of someone who knew this might be the last chance. "I'm proud of you, son." The word son landed like a bullet. Danny's throat closed around all the things he wanted to say, all the accusations and questions and grief that had been building for 38 years and suddenly had a target. But before he could speak, Bobby's eyes rolled back, and his body went rigid. The heart monitor attached to the stretcher began screaming a flat tone that every medical professional recognized instantly. Cardiac arrest. Rebecca was on him in seconds, hands positioned for CPR, counting compressions in the steady rhythm that separated professionals from amateurs. The paramedics pulled the defibrillator from its case, charged the paddles, and delivered the first shock, while Danny watched his father die for the second time in his life. The thought came unbidden and unwelcome. At least this time I'm here to see it happen. The defibrillator, discharged with a sound like thunder, compressed into a microsecond, and Bobby's body arced off the stretcher. The monitor screamed its flatline protest, while Rebecca counted compressions in a voice that stayed level through sheer force of will. Danny stood frozen, watching his father's chest rise and fall under someone else's hands, unable to process that 38 years of being dead could end with actual death before he'd gotten a single answer that mattered. The second shock brought back a rhythm, weak, irregular, but present. The monitor's tone shifted from death to crisis, and Rebecca's shoulders dropped half an inch as training gave way to relief. "We need to move, now." The ambulance ride to Boston General took 43 minutes that felt like geological epochs. Danny sat across from the stretcher ranger pressed against his legs, watching Bobby's chest rise and fall with mechanical assistance. Steve Mitchell rode up front with the driver making calls that Danny couldn't hear over the siren, but could imagine. FBI, DOJ, Homeland Security. The kind of alphabet soup that turned individual tragedies into case numbers and made people disappear into protective custody. Rebecca worked with the paramedics, monitoring vitals that refused to stabilize, adjusting medication drips with the kind of precision that came from too many patients dying despite perfect technique. Her eyes met Danny's once across the cramped space, and what he saw there wasn't pity. It was recognition. She'd watched people fight this same losing battle against biology, and time had held hands while families said goodbye to bodies that had stopped being people, somewhere in the transition from living to dying. Boston General's emergency entrance swallowed the ambulance into fluorescent brightness that made everyone look half dead. Nurses materialized with the kind of organized chaos that came from Level 1 trauma centers processing human damage as routine. Bobby disappeared behind double doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only," and Danny found himself standing in a waiting room that smelled like disinfectant and desperation. Steve appeared at his elbow with coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during the previous administration. "You're going to want to sit down for this conversation." They found chairs in a corner, away from the other families, waiting for news that would either shatter or spare them. Steve pulled out a tablet and brought up files that made Danny's security clearance look inadequate. Elena Volkov, 73 years old, Russian organized crime, running Boston operations since 1979, connected to SVRGRU and half a dozen other acronyms that all mean the same thing: foreign intelligence. She's been on our watch list for 45 years, and we've never been able to make anything stick. The photo showed a woman with steel gray hair and eyes that suggested she'd seen worse things than FBI raids and lived to profit from them. Aristocratic features that wealth and ruthlessness had preserved past their natural expiration. According to our friends in the vestibule, Bobby Wilson worked for her in the mid-'80s, forced labor to pay off gambling debts. He was supposed to help move stolen goods through the shipyard where he worked, but instead he disappeared in 1986, staged his own death, and vanished. Steve swiped to another file, this one showing newspaper clippings from New Hampshire. Fatal train accident, claims local man. The grainy photo showed emergency responders searching railroad tracks, and Danny's stomach turned over because he remembered this. Remembered his mother's face when the police came to the door. Remembered the funeral with a closed casket because there hadn't been enough left to view. All of it theater, a performance his father had staged to escape consequences that would have found their way to a 7-year-old boy and his mother. We raided Volkov's estate 2 hours ago. She's in custody at the federal building in Boston, along with Kenny and the rest of her retrieval team. Dr. Parker was arrested at his home in Greenwich. He's already asking for a lawyer and immunity. Danny's hands tightened around the coffee cup, hard enough to make the cheap plastic creak. How long has this been planned, the chip in Bobby's monitor? At least 6 months based on preliminary forensics. Parker approached Volkov's people with the opportunity. Terminal patient traveling alone, perfect courier. They paid him $5 million to hollow out the Holter monitor and install the encrypted drive. The plan was simple. Bobby travels to Boston, they retrieve the device, he dies of cancer within a few months, and nobody asks questions. Except Bobby didn't know. No, he was a victim twice over. Once when Volkov forced him to work for her in the 80s, and again when Parker turned him into a blind mule. Steve's tablet showed security footage from Memorial Sloan Kettering, grainy but clear enough. Dr. Parker escorting Bobby into a back room, returning 45 minutes later while Bobby slept in the waiting room. The timestamp matched Bobby's story exactly. The tea was dosed with a mild sedative, nothing that would show up in a standard tox screen, especially not in a patient already on heavy pain medication. Parker had time to install the chip, seal the monitor, and return it without Bobby ever knowing. Danny thought about his father, sitting in that waiting room, trusting the doctor who was supposed to be helping him die with dignity, having no idea his body was being violated in ways that would bring violence and terror into the last months of his life. What happens now? Parker goes away for a long time. Volkov too, if we can connect her directly to the operation. Kenny and his team are looking at federal charges that add up to life without parole. Steve paused, and something in his expression shifted. And Bobby gets protective custody until we're sure Volkov doesn't have any other assets looking to tie up loose ends. After that, he's free to die however he wants, in peace, hopefully. The words "die however he wants" landed like a punch. Danny had spent 38 years believing his father was dead, and now he had maybe 4 months to figure out how to forgive a ghost that had suddenly become flesh. Rebecca found them 3 hours later, still in Scrub's exhaustion, pulling at every line of her face. He's stable. ICU monitored, but his heart found a rhythm it likes. The oncology team is reviewing his case now. She sat down without being invited, and Ranger immediately put his head on her lap. She petted him absently, her hands moving with the automatic comfort of someone who understood that sometimes you needed to touch something alive to remember you hadn't died yet. He's asking for you. Danny's throat closed. He wanted to refuse to walk out of this hospital and back to the life he'd built on the foundation of his father's absence. But Ranger was already on his feet, and Rebecca was looking at him with the kind of expectation that suggested running away wasn't actually an option. The ICU smelled like dying with better equipment. Bobby lay in a bed that made him look even smaller than he had on the train, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed their mechanical lullaby. Oxygen mask instead of cannula now, IV lines running into arms that were mostly bone wrapped in skin. His eyes opened when Danny entered, and the hope that flared there was painful to witness. "You came." "Didn't have much choice. Your dog wouldn't let me leave." Ranger had already claimed position beside the bed, his head resting on the mattress, within inches of Bobby's hand. The gesture was protective and proprietary in equal measure, and Bobby's fingers found their way into the dog's fur with the automatic comfort of repetition. Danny stood at the foot of the bed, maintaining distance that felt necessary for survival. "The FBI says Elena Volkov forced you to work for her, that you disappeared to protect Mom and me." Bobby's hand trembled where it rested on Ranger's head. "I owed money to the wrong people. $50,000 trying to help a friend who disappeared the moment the loan sharks showed up. Elena bought the debt and offered me a choice: work for her or watch my family die." His voice came muffled through the oxygen mask, each word requiring effort that his lungs could barely afford. "I ran shipyard operations for 2 years, moved stolen goods, laundered money through the payroll system. Every day I told myself it was temporary, that I'd find a way out. Then the FBI started investigating, and Elena decided I was a liability." Bobby's eyes closed, and Danny wondered if he was gathering strength or just unable to face what came next. "She gave me an ultimatum: disappear forever or wake up to find Catherine and Danny dead. I chose the only thing that let you live. You chose to let us think you were dead." The accusation hung between them like smoke from a fire that had been burning for 38 years. "I chose to let you grow up safe. Elena kept tabs on everyone I'd ever known. If I'd stayed, if she'd even suspected I was still in contact, you would have become leverage. She would have used you to make me do whatever she wanted, and when she was done, you'd both disappear." Bobby's hand lifted from Ranger and reached toward Danny, trembling with more than just cancer. "I know it doesn't make it right. I know you grew up without a father, and Catherine worked herself to death trying to be both parents. I know I'm asking you to forgive 38 years in the 4 months I have left, but I need you to understand I didn't abandon you. I saved you the only way I knew how." Danny's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Part of him wanted to believe, it wanted the narrative that made his father a hero instead of a coward. But the 7-year-old who'd asked when Daddy was coming home, the teenager who'd gotten into fights defending his dead father's honor, the Navy SEAL who'd pushed himself to exhaustion trying to be the man his father had never taught him to be. All those versions of Danny were screaming that it wasn't enough. Mom died in 2010. Heart attack. She was 58 years old and looked 70 because she'd spent 24 years working herself to death. Bobby's face crumpled. "I know. I read the obituary. I almost came to the funeral, but Elena's people were still watching. Even after all that time, she never stopped looking for me. You could have told me. After Mom died, you could have reached out." "And say what? Hi, son, I've been alive this whole time. Sorry, I let you believe otherwise." What good would that have done except make everything worse? Danny had no answer for that. He turned toward the window instead, looking out at Boston's skyline, lit up against the November darkness. Somewhere out there, his mother was buried in Cedar Grove Cemetery, under a headstone that listed her as survived by one son and preceded in death by her husband. All of it was true, and all of it was a lie. Rebecca appeared in the doorway with the kind of timing that suggested she'd been listening. "Visiting hours are over. He needs rest." Danny nodded and moved toward the door. Ranger didn't follow. The dog stayed exactly where he was, head on the bed, eyes moving between Bobby and Danny with the expression of an animal trying to understand why its pack was broken. "Ranger, come." The command came out harsher than Danny intended. Ranger whined, but obeyed, padding over, with his tail low and his ears back, confused, distressed by the scent of grief and anger and love, all tangled together into something his training hadn't prepared him to handle. Bobby's voice stopped Danny at the threshold. "I watched you become the man I never got to teach you to be. Every article, every deployment, every medal. I know it doesn't count for anything, but I was proud, am proud, of the son who survived without me." Danny left without answering because there was no answer that wouldn't break something inside him that he needed intact. The days blurred into a routine that felt like penance. Danny rented an apartment near the hospital, close enough to walk. Ranger settled into the space like he'd always lived there, claiming the spot beside the bed and refusing to sleep anywhere else. Rebecca appeared on day 3 with takeout and the kind of determined friendliness that suggested she'd decided Danny needed saving from himself. "You don't have to do this alone." She sat on the floor with Ranger's head in her lap, eating Thai food straight from the container, while Danny pretended the hospital food he'd brought back was edible. Do what alone? Figure out how to forgive him, how to be angry and grateful at the same time, how to grieve someone who's not dead yet, but will be soon. Her voice carried the weight of experience, and Danny remembered what she'd said on the train. Lost her father to lung cancer 2 years ago. Same disease, same impossible countdown. My dad spent his last 6 months apologizing for things that weren't his fault. Apologizing for dying, for getting sick, for not being there for my college graduation because he was in the hospital. It drove me crazy. She set down her food and looked at Danny with eyes that had seen this story play out too many times. I wanted to tell him to stop apologizing and just be my dad for whatever time we had left, but I was too angry about all the time we'd wasted on his guilt to say it. And then he was gone, and I had to live with the fact that our last conversation was me telling him to stop talking about the past. The implication hung between them, and Danny hated how clearly he understood it. He had 4 months, maybe less, 4 months to decide whether he could forgive 38 years or whether he'd carry the anger for the rest of his life with nobody left to be angry at. Father William Bennett arrived on day 7, announced by the ICU nurse as Mr. Wilson's priest from Vermont. He was 75 if he was a day with white hair and the kind of face that suggested he'd spent a lifetime hearing confessions and keeping secrets. He found Danny in the hallway outside Bobby's room. "You must be Daniel. Your father talks about you." The casual use of "your father" made Danny's jaw clench, but he nodded anyway. "Father Bennett, Bobby mentioned you helped him with personal issues." "Alcoholism mainly. After he left Boston, he spent 2 years at the bottom of every bottle he could find. I helped him climb back out." The priest's eyes held the kind of compassion that came from forgiving people who didn't deserve it and loving them anyway. "He never stopped being your father, Daniel. Never stopped watching from a distance. It wasn't the life he wanted, but it was the only one that kept you safe." People keep saying that, like it makes everything okay. It doesn't make it okay. It makes it understandable. There's a difference. Father Bennett moved toward Bobby's room, then paused. Forgiveness isn't about saying what happened was acceptable. It's about deciding you're not going to let it poison what time you have left, with him or with yourself. He disappeared into the room, and Danny was left alone with Ranger and the weight of wisdom he wasn't ready to accept. Week 2 brought paperwork. Steve Mitchell appeared with forms that turned Bobby's protective custody into something more manageable, and the FBI officially declared him a victim rather than a person of interest. Doctor! Parker had confessed everything in exchange for a plea deal that would still put him in federal prison until he was 90. Elena Volkov was awaiting trial on charges that included conspiracy, attempted murder, and enough RICO violations to fill a phone book. Danny signed the papers that made him Bobby's medical power of attorney because there was nobody else, no other family, no friends from the Vermont years who knew Bobby was really Robert Wilson, just a son who'd spent 38 years as an orphan and was now responsible for deciding how his father would die. Week 4 brought the first cooking lesson. Bobby was strong enough to sit up weak enough that he couldn't hold a spoon steady. Rebecca helped Danny set up a hot plate in the ICU's family room, and they made marinara sauce, following instructions Bobby dictated from memory. Your grandmother Maria taught me this recipe the week before I married your mother. Said any man who couldn't feed his wife wasn't worth keeping. Bobby's voice came stronger now, the oxygen doing its job even as the cancer continued its slow consumption. She died before you were born, would have loved you, would have been furious with me for leaving. Danny chopped tomatoes with more force than necessary, letting the rhythm of the knife against cutting board fill the silence that threatened to swallow them. Mom never remarried, never even dated as far as I know. I know. I hoped she would. Hoped she'd find someone who could be the father you deserved. The sauce simmered, filling the small room with smells that pulled at memories Danny didn't know he had. Sitting in a high chair, red sauce on his hands, laughter that might have been his mother's, or might have been invented by a brain desperate to fill the gaps. They ate together in Bobby's room, and the silence felt less like accusation and more like truce. Week 8 brought the letter. Danny had been sorting through his mother's belongings, finally dealing with boxes that had sat in storage since her death. He found it in the bottom of her jewelry box, underneath costume pearls and the wedding ring she'd never stopped wearing. The envelope was yellowed with age, the postmark smudged but readable, 1995. 9 years after Bobby had supposedly died, 9 years after the funeral with the empty casket. Inside, a single page, in handwriting Danny didn't recognize, but Bobby would. Catherine, Danny's 10 now. I saw his picture in the school newsletter. You should tell the principal to be more careful about what gets posted online. He looks like you, has your smile. I hope he has your strength too. I'm still alive. Still hiding, still watching from a distance that keeps you safe. Elena Volkov's people check on you every few months. If they knew I was in contact, they'd use you to get to me. I can't let that happen. I know you're working 3 jobs.
I know it's killing you. I have money saved, nothing illegal, just construction work under a fake name. I tried to send it 6 times, but every attempt was flagged by someone watching your accounts. They're waiting for me to make contact. I can't give them that. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I left. I'm sorry you're alone. I'm sorry Danny will grow up thinking his father didn't love him enough to stay. I love you both. That's the only truth that matters. Robert, the page shook in Danny's hands. His mother had known. For 14 years before she died, Catherine Wilson
had known her husband was alive and had kept that secret locked inside where it couldn't escape and destroy the life she'd built for her son. There were 37 more letters in the box, one for every year from 1987 to 2010, the year his mother died. Each one filled with apologies and updates and the kind of longing that came from watching a life from the outside. Each one proof that Bobby had never stopped being a father even when pretending to be dead. Danny brought them to the hospital and dropped the box on Bobby's bed hard enough to make the IV lines rattle. She knew. Mom knew you were alive. Bobby's face went gray, and for a moment Danny thought he might code again, but he just reached for the box with trembling hands and pulled out a letter at random. I sent them through a service. No return address, no way to trace them. I didn't know if she read them or burned them or just... I hoped she'd understand. She kept them all, hidden where I'd never look, carried your secret for 23 years. Danny's voice broke on the number because 23 years was most of his life. His entire childhood and adolescence spent grieving a man who was alive. His mother spending those same years knowing the truth and choosing to let him believe the lie. Why didn't she tell me? Same reason I didn't come back. If you'd known I was alive, you would have looked for me. And if Elena's people had noticed, they would have used you to force me out of hiding. Your mother understood that. She chose your safety over everything else. Bobby pulled out another letter, this one dated 2009. I wrote to her when she got sick, told her I wanted to visit, wanted to say goodbye. She wrote back only time she ever did. Told me if I showed up at that hospital, she'd have security throw me out. Said she'd rather die believing I was protecting our son than see me and know I'd put him at risk. The letter trembled in Bobby's hands, and Danny couldn't tell if it was the cancer or grief making him shake. She loved you more than she loved me, enough to let me stay dead so you could live. Week 10 brought hospice. The oncology team delivered the news with practiced gentleness. The cancer had spread faster than projected. Maybe 2 months left, maybe less. Time to transition from treatment to comfort care. They moved Bobby to a hospice facility that overlooked Boston Harbor, where he could watch ships come and go while his own voyage reached its end. Danny came every day. Ranger came every day. Rebecca came when her shifts allowed, bringing the kind of practical comfort that nurses learned to give when medicine couldn't. Father Bennett drove down from Vermont and stayed in a hotel nearby, visiting daily to hear confessions that Danny suspected were just Bobby's way of having someone to talk to who wasn't his dying of resentment son. They didn't talk about forgiveness. They talked about Navy deployments and the mechanics of fixing engines and whether the Red Sox would ever win another World Series. Surface conversations that let them pretend they were just a father and son catching up, not a dying man, and the family he'd abandoned, trying to compress 38 years into 60 days. But week 11 brought a shift. Danny arrived to find Bobby barely conscious. His breathing labored even with maximum oxygen support. The hospice nurse, a kind woman named Patricia, pulled Danny aside. "It's close now. Days, maybe. You should say whatever needs saying." Danny sat beside the bed and watched his father struggle for breath. Ranger put his head on the mattress, and Bobby's hand found the dog's fur by instinct. "I forgive you." The words came out hoarse, pulled from somewhere deep that Danny hadn't known existed. "I don't understand it. I'm still angry. I'm still hurt, but I forgive you for choosing our lives over your own. Mom would have wanted that." Bobby's eyes opened clearer than they'd been in days. "Thank you." 2 words, barely a whisper, but they carried the weight of 38 years lifting. I wasted so much time hiding. Don't waste yours, Danny. Find someone. Build a family. Be the man I taught you to be without meaning to. Danny thought about Rebecca, about the way she'd appeared in his life at exactly the moment he needed someone who understood grief, about the quiet dinners and the comfortable silences, and the way Ranger had decided she was pack. I think I might have already found someone. Bobby's smile was fragile but genuine. Good. Name your first kid after your mother. She'd like that. The end came 3 days later, peacefully, for once. Danny was there holding Bobby's hand. Rebecca stood beside him. Ranger lay with his head on Bobby's chest, feeling each breath slow and stop. Father Bennett prayed quietly in the corner, his voice a gentle rhythm under the beeping monitors. Bobby's last words were about Catherine, about seeing her, about going home after 38 years of exile. And then he was gone, and Danny was an orphan again, but this time he'd gotten to say goodbye. The funeral was small. Danny, Rebecca, Father Bennett, Steve Mitchell paying respects. They buried Bobby next to Catherine in Cedar Grove Cemetery, the headstone finally telling the truth. Robert Eugene Wilson, 1946 to 2025, beloved husband and father. Finally home. Danny spoke briefly, his voice steady, despite the grief crushing his chest. My father wasn't perfect. He made choices I still don't fully understand, but he made those choices to save my life and my mother's. He spent 38 years in exile so we could be safe. That's not abandonment, that's sacrifice. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it. Ranger sat beside the grave long after everyone else had left his head resting on the fresh earth. When Danny finally coaxed him away, the dog left his collar behind the one that said, "Working Canine." He was retired now. His mission was complete. 6 months later, Danny stood in Boston Public Garden with Rebecca watching autumn paint the trees in shades of copper and gold. Her hand rested on the small swell of her belly, 3 months along, just starting to show. Catherine, if it's a girl, Robert, if it's a boy. Rebecca leaned against him, and Ranger pressed close to both of them, completing the pack. Your dad would have loved this, getting to be a grandfather. He knew, I told him. Those last days, he knew there'd be someone carrying forward. Danny pulled the letter from his pocket, the final one left with Father Bennett, to be delivered after Bobby's death. He'd read it 50 times, but the words still hit like they were new. Danny, by the time you read this, I'm gone. Not truly gone. I'm in the wind when you sail in the anchor. You keep in the child you'll raise. Don't hate me for leaving. Thank you for letting me come back. You asked me once why I stayed away even after Mom died. The truth is, I was afraid. Afraid you'd see me as the coward who ran instead of the father who sacrificed. Afraid the reality of me would disappoint you more than the memory of what I might have been. But these last months showed me something. You became the man I hoped you'd be without any help from me. You became someone who protects the weak, who stands up for what's right, who makes impossible choices and lives with the consequences. You became the father I never was. Raise your children to know their grandfather wasn't perfect, but also know he loved them before they were born, the same way he loved you from a distance for 38 years. Love is sacrifice. Remember that when it gets hard. I'm proud of you, son. Always have been. Dad. Danny folded the letter and slipped it back into his pocket. Ranger nudged his hand, and Danny scratched behind the dog's ears the way Bobby had taught him in those final weeks. Come on, boy. Let's go home. They walked through the park, as the sun set over the harbor, painting the water in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere across the city in Cedar Grove Cemetery, two graves sat side by side under maple trees that had started to drop their leaves. Robert and Catherine Wilson together again after 38 years apart. Danny thought about forgiveness and sacrifice and the choices people made when all the options were terrible. He thought about his father, watching from a distance, collecting newspaper clippings, and living a half-life so his son could have a whole one. He thought about his mother keeping secrets that must have crushed her, choosing Danny's safety over her own need for truth. And he understood finally that love wasn't always about staying. Sometimes it was about leaving. Sometimes the greatest act of devotion was disappearing so the people you loved could survive. Rebecca's hand found his. "You okay?" "Yeah, I think I finally am." Above them, a train whistle echoed across the harbor, and Danny smiled. The journey that had started on an Amtrak train with a dying stranger and ended with a father reclaimed was complete. Bobby Wilson had come home, and so had Danny Jackson, in all the ways that mattered. Ranger barked once sharp and clear and took off running toward a flock of pigeons that had no chance of escape, but would provide excellent entertainment anyway. Danny laughed, and the sound felt like healing. Life, he thought, watching his dog chase birds, while his pregnant girlfriend rolled her eyes affectionately beside him. Life was what you built from the rubble of everything that tried to destroy you. His father had taught him that without meaning to, and Danny would teach it to his own children when they asked about the grandfather who'd loved them from beyond the grave. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was unwritten, and Danny held the pen.